Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Human Happy Hour. Today, we are joined by Omkari Williams. And Omkari is a certified coach, author, and podcast host who is dedicated to social justice activism. She is the host of the popular podcast Stepping into Truth, Conversations on Social Justice and How We Get Free, where she engages with guests on issues related to social justice and activism. So glad to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about activism and some of the things that you do. So excited to learn from you on that. So how do you define an activist, and what inspired you to become one?
Well, I think the first thing is, I love that question because I think people have a really narrow view often of what an activist looks like, and they default to thinking it's Dr. King or Greta Thunberg or someone who's willing to stand on a stage. And that is absolutely true. Those people are definitely activists, but so are all the people in the audience listening to them. So are all the people out there doing the work every day that we never hear about. So I define an activist as someone who takes action, literally someone who takes action on something that they care about. And ideally, they take action in a consistent way. And so I really look at it from the perspective of, how do you get someone to take consistent action that is sustainable for them? Because otherwise, the capacity to do this all the time is really limited. And the idea of burning yourself to a crisp for this is not helpful. We need people who can stay in the struggles that we're encountering for the long haul. So I really have a different perspective on activism and activists, and I really look at it as, how can you make it part of your life? How can you integrate it into your everyday behavior? So to me, that's what an activist really is. And as to how I came to it, honestly, I was kind of born into it. My father did relief work. He was a humanitarian. He was very involved in causes all around the world, Rwanda, the war in the former Yugoslavia. I mean, you name it, it was what he did. And so my whole experience of being his daughter was of watching someone step into really terrible situations. Sometimes they were man-made, sometimes they were natural disasters, but terrible situations, and doing what he could do to help make the situation better for the people impacted. So it just feels like, if you see something that's terrible, you just do what you can to help. That's essentially my philosophy.
I love that. It's so healthy. I think having been in activist spaces and knowing people that have dealt with burnout, and having thrown myself in some instances, you do realize like you need a long-term, sustainable, healthy way to think about it. So I love the way that you broke that down and said, like, you need to be able to take regular actions, but keep taking those actions without putting yourself under undue pressure.
And, I think, Rena, one of the things that happens in our culture in particular is we have this whole attitude of go big or go home.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine in the Super Bowl. It's actually not really helpful in most of life, because that's just not something we can maintain. We just can't. And I don't even think we're meant to, because I feel like that whole thing shifts the focus away from things that are human scale and human size to something that is sort of superhuman. And I don't actually aspire to that. I aspire to being a really good human in a human scale. And that's what I try and help other people find their way to make their human scale contribution. Sometimes things happen and your contribution gets exploded massively into something you never imagined, and that's fantastic. But I don't think that should be the goal. I think the goal should be to make the impact you can and live your life, right? Not have it be that you can only do this once a year because it takes so much from you. How much more beneficial to society at large if instead of doing something once a year, you're doing something once a week or every day or every other day, whatever you can maintain.
Yeah. Also, even little things like, even if you're not trying to do anything grand or something that you want to put out there, even being kind to someone at the grocery store, you might make their day and they might go home and come up with something that goes big, like good ripples into the universe just is the best.
I so appreciate that you said that, because I think that something we often underestimate is the power of our interactions with people on a regular basis. And I mean, if you think about it, or maybe you're emotionally healthier than I am, but I remember things that happened to me that were just like small little things that stick with me forever. I'll think years later, I'll think, gosh, that thing happened and I still feel like icky about it, right? The good things, we don't tend to notice them as much for as long. So I think it's even more important that we have more of them to remind us that actually most people are good and most people are kind, and that there is a reason to keep doing this work, and that there is a reason to keep fighting for the things we're fighting for. I mean, we're biologically predisposed to notice what's wrong, which is why the things that go wrong stick with us.
Yeah.
But being able to sort of smother those things that are wrong with the things that are right is so important.
Yeah.
So I think that's just hugely impactful, the tiny little things that we don't even notice and mean so much to the person who we've done that kindness to.
Yeah, and I think to your point about people thinking go big or go home, right? I think a lot of people maybe don't even engage in activism because they think it has to be this like big grand thing, where it could be just like a day-to-day activity. So for people that might be listening and thinking about that, do you have some examples of like what you would consider activism and day-to-day stuff?
Sure. I mean, you could literally take something as tiny as thinking about this. If you live in a big city, as I used to, I grew up in Manhattan, and Manhattan has its cycles of being dirty to filthy. I mean, it's just never clean because it's a huge city. But imagine if everyone picked up one piece of trash and put it in a bin. Manhattan would be clean. I mean, Manhattan would be immaculate, right? So something as tiny as picking up the trash that someone left outside the door of your office building, something as tiny as being kind to the elderly person who's in line in front of you in the grocery store and is having a hard time figuring something out. So they're slowing everybody up. And instead of standing there and huffing and making them feel even more flustered and more unappreciated, just being kind, right? I mean, that's what we want for ourselves. And that to me is activism. That to me is bringing people into the human family the same way we bring people into our biological families if we like them, our families of choice if our biological families are problematic for us. Just recognizing that also something like, yeah, I would love to solve the problem of world hunger, but doesn't it matter if I feed one person? It certainly matters to the person that I feed. Everything doesn't have to be this huge scale to make an impact. And maybe that person I feed is then able to go out and gather the resources that they need because they're not hungry, right? They're able to go out and do something that makes their situation less precarious because they're not hungry. So I think that we just need to expand our understanding of what matters and take it out of that it has to be big or it really doesn't count. And that's what I'm kind of dedicated to.
Wow. It seems like you're touching on something I've always thought of, that I think empathy should be taught in school.
Oh,
Because that seems to be a big problem. And I think it's something you learn, or you can learn the opposite by accident if you have parents that aren't very empathetic.
It's funny that you say that, because I've been having this thought about it lately, because I'd had an experience with someone and I thought they don't have a lot of empathy. And then I realized that that actually is something that most of us learn. Well, I think children are very empathetic, and we either maintain that or it can kind of get stomped out of us.
Stomped.
But letting that empathy, letting that ability to put yourself in someone else's position is so hugely important, because I mean, I have been really fortunate. I have never been without a home. I've always had a roof over my head. But I can imagine what it would be like to not have a roof over my head. And that impacts how I engage with people who are unhoused. I try not to go into it with all this judgment about, well, if you were doing something else better, then you would be living in a place. It's, would that it were that simple. So I do think that having a conscious connection to, let me tap into my empathy when I find myself starting to judge someone or starting to have an opinion that is informed by absolutely nothing. Let me just tap into my empathy instead and see how I can help. I mean, it literally is Mr. Rogers, look for the helpers.
I love that line by Mr. Rogers too. I think it's such a great way to explain that to kids.
Yeah.
Which one? I used to watch it, but I don't remember what.
Right.
Look for the helpers.
Look for the helpers.
Yeah.
Oh yeah! Wow. I just remembered the trolley.
Yeah.
It's
had
a lot
such
about
a-
heroes, your heroes too. I mean, nowadays heroes, I mean, I didn't watch Tony Soprano when I was a kid. I watched MacGyver and Star Trek. So I learned a lot about, empathy and equality, and now if I were watching Game of Thrones or Walking Dead, I would learn, I mean, I love the show, but if as a kid, which they do watch it, you're not learning the same thing. You don't have the same heroes, it seems.
I remember when the show Survivor first came out, the very first season, and I thought, oh, well, that sounds really great. So it's all these people on an island, and if they help each other, they survive. And my friend said, nope. And told me what the premise was. And I said, I'm never watching that.
Yeah.
And I've never seen the show.
Yeah.
Why do I want to watch a show where people are just pitted against one another rather than working to support one another? I mean, I just think that whole premise is so horrifying to me, and that it's so popular should bother us, because we should be elevating collective compassion and helping one another, not this dog eat dog, let me see if I can push you off this rock so that I can win all this money. I mean, yeah, I will never watch that show.
I don't know that I've ever watched it. It did not appeal to me. But I often think that mentality is very like US centered, and how do we even begin to it's in all of our media, it's in like our workplaces. How do you even begin to kind of kick people out of that, that mentality?
It's kind of interesting, because we can drop it when there's a crisis. I was in Manhattan on September 11th, and the way people behaved was remarkable. I mean, I was born and raised in Manhattan, and I'd never seen anything like that. People were their absolute best selves for that day and the days that followed, for a couple of weeks. And then, we all went back to normal. Oh, well. But it's a choice. The going back to normal and having what normal looks like, it's a choice. We made a choice in those days after that tragedy to be our best selves. We made a choice to reach out to people we did not know and try and be helpful and try and bring comfort to people who were completely freaking out. And then, we sort of went back to our old way of being, but that we were able to do that tells me that we're able to do that. It's simply, we don't choose to do that. And I think that part of it is because of what's valued. If Survivor, in its 4,000th season or whatever it's in right now, if people didn't value that, that wouldn't still be on the air. But people think that that's actually a good way to be. They think it's something worthy of emulation. And I think we've gone really off base in that. And that if we can sort of bring ourselves back to understanding that we are so much stronger when we are a healthy collective than when we are in just this relentless competitive state.
That's such a great example. September 11th and being there and seeing that.
How do we do that though? How do we I mean, obviously nothing's going to happen in our lifetime, but how do we send stuff into the future, like send positive vibes so that people start making a change and actually want to do that without getting discouraged? Like, that's the tough thing, it seems.
I think a lot of it is about where we put our focus. And it's really easy to put our focus on the things that are wrong. And I am not saying that I don't. I mean, you should hear me. I can rant on a whole bunch of topics for quite a long time. But what is way more motivating than what you're against is what you're for. And I don't think we often spend enough time thinking about, well, what am I for? Yeah, I'm against fascism, but what am I for? I'm for a thriving democracy. And what does that require? What does that look like? I'm for equality across the board of gender and sexual orientation and ethnicity and country of origin. What does that look like to be for that rather than just against racism or sexism or classism? And so I think when we start engaging from the what are you for perspective, that actually is way more motivating. That actually allows us to stay in the work and to do the work more deeply than the perspective of what are we just angry about. I mean, anger is great fuel, but it burns out pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's such an excellent point. And I think yeah, I definitely fall into that when you're looking at it, you're like, oh, everything's so broken. And you're so mad about everything. But then you're right. You have to try to refocus and go, well, what am I for? That's such a great way to center and then think about how to take some kind of action.
Yeah, and anger doesn't really help motivate anybody, because anybody that's on your side's already on your side, and anybody that's not on your side is going to dig their heels in more because you've either insulted them or made them feel bad. So really you being just a positive influence in person can rub off on people, hopefully your children, because I think it is a generation thing.
Definitely. And what you just said there, Jason, is really, I think, incredibly important, because people talk about changing someone's mind. And I don't believe we ever change anyone's mind. I believe we change our own minds. And I believe that what happens is people will see what we're doing, and that will cause them to perhaps rethink what they're doing or what they think. But we don't actually change anyone's mind. We can't even make a 2-year-old do what we want them to do. How are we going to make a 50-year-old do what we want them to do, right? But we still have this idea in our heads that we're able to change someone else's mind. And I don't actually think it works like that.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I worked on a piece and interviewed several people about talking to somebody when you're on a friend, when you're on opposite side of the spectrum, and a lot of the experts and people that worked in that realm where like, yeah, you can't just shout things and say things and change somebody's mind. And that seems to be the issue that people are running into, is that they think that they can do that. And it's just not a thing, really.
It is not a thing.
So I want to ask you, because there have been some things in the news lately, specifically, as we're coming off, it's a few years now, like post George Floyd, and there were all, speaking of changing minds and changing behaviors and everything, right? So I live in the corporate world and corporate media, and and so there was a piece that came out recently that was talking about a lot of the DEI professionals that were hired getting laid off, as some of these early layoffs, and a lot of this being lip service and things sort of rolling back. And so how can we ensure that there's the current focus, where we were talking about race and racism, how do we keep that on track and try to make meaningful, lasting change, rather than it becoming a trend that, is then phased out?
I was having this conversation with a couple of friends a few weeks ago. They were over for lunch, and we spent 4 hours sitting around my dining table talking about this kind of thing, and alternately crying and laughing, right? Because some of it is just so demoralizing. But I think that the thing we sort of finally came to, let me back up on that. One of the things that we came to is that it was inevitable that this whole sort of reluctance to stay in this DEI work would happen. A, because it's hard work, and B, because once the attention is off of it, there's not really the motivation for people to keep doing it, in the corporate world. And if you have no direct investment in this happening, it's really easy to let it go to the side, because there's the rest of life, and life is busy and it's pressing, and there are all these things happening, and people get really caught up in their own lives, and we all do. And I think that what people with privilege, so, a lot of people who are white and have the privilege of not having to engage with racism in their lives as a regular thing, I think often they don't understand the cost to them of racism. Racism costs everybody. Its most direct cost, obviously, is to the people it's directed at, but it costs everybody. And if we were able to engage with it from that perspective, it would be more highly valued by the corporate world. It would be more highly valued by the educational world, and people would put more attention on it. Money follows what you value, and we're seeing what people value. And progress has been made, and some of it has slipped, but progress has been made. There are people who are aware of this whole challenge of becoming a society that is actively anti-racist, who were not aware of that before George Floyd in the same way. It just hadn't shown up on their radar. And so now we're in this position of just having to engage with the whole experience of race and racism in a direct way that we hadn't had to before. And it's just, it's different. It's just different.
As a white, cis, heterosexual male, what advice would you give me on being helpful but not annoying? Because it can be difficult sometimes as a white male to be an ally, because you're seen as a person that doesn't understand. And I agree, I don't. But I also care so much about it. And I sometimes feel like I can't express it as much because I feel like a faker or you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it's difficult.
I think that the first thing that anyone can do when they're in a circumstance like that, where they care about something, but they also recognize that I'm in a pretty privileged position here, is to be curious, ask questions of people and just say, I'm curious about this. My experience is limited and constrained by these particular circumstances, being white, male, cis, and I understand that your experience is really different. And I'm curious. And when I say that, I'm not asking you to have them be there to educate you. I'm simply saying, acknowledge that you don't know and that you're learning and that you're willing to be corrected if you make a mistake, right? I mean, we all make mistakes. I make mistakes. And also to just extend compassion on both sides, compassion for yourself, compassion for the person who's trying to learn something. Sometimes I think about it this way. All of us learn to walk, right? And, all of us without disabilities learn to walk. We all fell down for many, many, many times before we got the walking right. And no one around us was going, oh, I can't believe you didn't get the walking right the first time. Nobody says that to a toddler. Nobody. And yet we will say to people who make a mistake about something like race, we'll just cancel them. How is that helpful? And I'm not talking about people who are deliberately being creeps. I'm talking about people who genuinely made a mistake.
Yep.
We have to have a little more compassion, a little more grace for each other than that, or we get nowhere.
So be kind to each other, even at
and
the
ourselves.
Expense of yourself.
But also to yourself, because we do make mistakes, and beating yourself up is not helpful.
Yeah.
It makes you less likely to engage in the process.
That's sort of related to another question that we have here of Jason's question to you, which is a lot of your work deals with the effects of patriarchy and privilege. So what role do people in positions of power and privilege play in promoting social justice, and how can they use their influence to affect change?
Again, here's an opportunity for people to have an incredible impact. If you are in a position of privilege, you can step aside. You can share that privilege with someone else, right? You can say, I'm going to pass the mic to you. Or you can, if you're in a meeting with someone and you are in a position of privilege, whether it's because of your race, whether it's because of your length of time in your organization, whatever it is, you can choose to have someone with less privilege by your side and make sure that they're part of the conversation. There are so many ways that you can just stop centering yourself. And there are all sorts of privilege. I mean, I walk through the world with a fair amount of privilege myself, even though I also have the challenges of being Black and female in this society. But I'm educated and I'm middle class. And, and I know how to advocate for myself. So those are all privileges that I come into a room with that someone else may not have. So my choice to say, I'm going to sit next to the person who looks most uncomfortable in this circumstance can sort of, some of my privilege can kind of rub off on them a little bit and create some space for them that they might not otherwise have.
That's a really great way to put that, to just kind of be in the space and support somebody.
One of the things that I think is really important to understand is that we live in a society where so much of how it's structured is based on relationship, who you know, the school you went to, and all of the structures in there that can support you going out into the world. But if you are in the position of having a marginalized identity where those structures are not part of the culture in the same way, then you walk into the dominant culture and you're at a huge disadvantage because you don't have all of those underpinnings to your life. And so those of us who have more of those can share them and bring other people in, basically you're bringing someone to the party, right? You're just saying, here's how this goes. Let me introduce you to so-and-so. Let me tell them about who you are. Let me tell you about who they are, and make a connection in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. And so that really matters, because they could be this incredibly brilliant person who just doesn't have this particular set of tools in their tool belt because it doesn't exist for them. It doesn't exist in the community that they've grown up in. It doesn't exist in the community they currently work in. And so sharing what we have, sharing our blessings, honestly, is a huge thing, and it doesn't take very much.
Funny, when you talk about all this, I'm trying to process it, like I'm trying to solve world's problems right now, it seems almost. And
you let me know how that works out for you.
And I almost did this project, and I really came close to it. And I think I still might think about it, doing a documentary on conflict. And I did a lot of research on what causes conflict, and I kept narrowing it down, finding the root, and it kind of narrowed it down to self-preservation, survival instinct, and then how that affects it's like I learned that there's you, but then there's your children, your family, your neighborhood, your community, your town, your county. It goes, and depending on who's against you, like whether it's whatever it is, you kind of group up, and it goes out to country, and it comes to borders, and it's all about self-preservation and taking as much as you can and telling the others to stay away because they might do something wrong to your whatever level community you're at. I mean, and I'm like, how do you stop that? And I thought, and then I saw is that Buddha? I thought to myself, that would be a really wonderful way if everybody thought of life like Buddhism. So yeah, could you solve the world's problems? I just laid it out for you.
No problem.
How do we do that?
Yeah. Hang on. I think that the thing that you said there, Jason, that I think is really the important piece is that piece about the concentric circles of there's me, then there's my family, then there's my extended family, then there's my community. And I think that, and this is what the Buddha is all about, is everyone's your family.
Yeah.
Every living thing is part of your family. You are not separate from anything. So there is actually no need to feel a threat, because if we looked on everyone as our family,
yep,
we'd be like, yeah, I'm going to take care of you.
Yeah.
And most of us in the world, and I'm speaking of the entire population of humanity, we want the same things. How we want to get there is different, but the basics that we want are absolutely the same. And we spend so much time focused on the differences, which are really differences of the path, not the goal. We want our children to be healthy and happy and have productive lives. We want to be healthy. We want to not have to worry about how we're going to survive in our old age. I mean, we all want those things. And yet we will fracture around how. Really, we're going to get into a fight about how when the what is the same? It makes no sense.
Yeah, that seems to be getting much worse lately, the how. So like throughout the course of you being in activism, how do you feel like things have changed in our current climate, and what challenges do activists face today?
Yeah, I have to say, I probably drink more than I used to before 2016. I mean, I can really look at a demarcation line and go, it wasn't great, but it wasn't this challenging.
Mhm.
And I think that part of it is, and Jason, you touched on this with conflict. I mean, people get into conflict when they're afraid they're going to lose something. And I think we are in a position in the United States in particular, where we are at a sort of tipping point of how is society going to evolve over the next 50, 100 years? Are we going to go back to quote unquote traditional values, or are we going to move forward to being a more democratic, inclusive society? And people will fight tooth and nail to protect the old values because they feel safe and comfortable, and they don't know what something new might look like. And I think that that is a lot of what we're encountering right now, is people feeling like, I just want to take care of myself and my family, and I don't know what's going to happen. So I'm going to just retreat into what felt safe, even when the truth is, it was never that safe, right? It was never particularly safe. Even in the, halcyon days of the post-war, people were still struggling, and, women were home and miserable, and the incidence of depression was really high. I mean, it wasn't the fantasy that Donna Reed had people believing it was. So I think we have to directly engage the things we're afraid of and look at whether that fear makes sense, or whether it's just a sort of knee-jerk reaction that we are having to change.
Yeah, it seems like white men had it really good. That's
I think white men had it pretty good.
Yeah, and I think that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think it was pretty sweet for you guys.
Yeah.
And someone once said, no man who is sane or sober ever gave up power willingly.
Yeah.
And that's, you have to be an extraordinary person to say, I have this and I'm going to share, because our understanding of sharing is that you have less.
Mm.
And that's not necessarily true. I mean, we're not talking about a cherry pie here where, you take out half of it and you have less pie. But on the other hand, you have all these other happy people who got their piece of the pie, who are not then looking to get into a fight with you about something or another. You may have to give up one thing, but what are you getting in exchange for that thing you're giving up? If you're giving up a little bit of your power and what you're getting is a world where there's more peace, so you don't actually need that power, that's an excellent trade-off. And I don't think we think about it that way.
Yeah, I think it drives me crazy with the narrative on crime and all of these things. And it's like, well, if we had a safe and equitable society and people were taken care of, then we wouldn't have all of these things, because people would be taken care of. And so to me, if you're wealthier or you're in a place of privilege, the reward of sharing some of that is like, oh, well, now I can walk down the street safely because my neighbors are housed and my neighbors have money to put food on the table. And so...
And it doesn't even seem like that hard a concept to grasp, but apparently it is more challenging than I realize it should be, because the reason you don't have high crime in wealthier neighborhoods is because people have what they need.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. That's the reason. Yeah. Mm-hmm. When people don't have what they need or don't perceive that they have what they need, then crime happens. So if you want less crime, make sure everyone gets taken care of.
Yeah. Well, and to do that, you'd have to get the people that have way more to agree to give a little back. And I think when you get too much money or too much power, I think it's like a psychological dementia or something. Because if you have billions of dollars, you honestly don't need that. It's
If you can't spend the money you have in your lifetime,
yeah.
there's nothing to even have a conversation around then.
Do you ever question though, like if you suddenly were a billionaire and gave it a year, do you think you'd get that dementia or whatever, that delusion of like, oh, I gotta protect it, or do you think you'd keep yourself the way you are now?
I think I would keep myself because the voice of my parents and my grandparents would be in my head so loudly that I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I turned into a jackass.
Yes.
So yeah,
that's right.
And also, I actually have a really strong sense of the concept of enough. And I think that that's something that we don't have a good grip on in this country. We don't have a good grip on what's enough.
Yeah.
You know, there are things I would certainly like if you said, I'm going to send you on an all expenses trip to the south of France for 2 weeks. I would not say no, but I don't need that. It would be nice, but I have enough. And I think when we have the understanding of enough, we engage in the world really differently, because then we start looking at, well, who doesn't have enough? I do. Who doesn't have enough? And what can I do about that? And I think that that's something that's going back to the empathy thing, is paying attention to that.
Yeah. What makes the owners of Walmart not care that all their employees could be making more money and they wouldn't even notice the difference in profit? What is that? How do you sleep at night? I'm not trying to insult them. I'm trying to ask the question.
No,
How?
it's legitimately a question. If you are working a full-time job and you can't support yourself, that's not okay.
Yeah.
That's just not acceptable. Yeah, and it perpetuates the cycle of poverty from one generation to another, because you can't get out of the cycle without extraordinarily helpful people and a lot of luck. And why should anyone have to count on that to be able to pull themselves out of poverty? But that is the way it's structured.
Generational poverty instead of generational wealth.
Yeah, I read something recently for an interview I'm doing for my podcast on how women and girls are trapped in poverty in this country. And the example that the writers gave was that this woman living in the Denver area was making something like $35,000 a year, maybe. I'm probably actually overstating what she was making, but to live in Denver, just a basic existence costs almost $90,000 a year.
Oh.
So how do you navigate that?
Yeah. How do you move? I mean, you can't even afford to move.
You can't even move. Nope.
That's very real in Los Angeles, where I am, and even and specifically in my neighborhood in West Hollywood. And so I go to city council meetings, and we'll talk, and all they want to do is fund the police more, because they're like, there's more crime. And we're like, but what if we house people? What if we work on how expensive the rent is, and
give dignity,
what people are making? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'll go and speak and say, like, but what if we take care of people instead of bloating this budget that we know is not actually going to help anyone? It's just going to protect wealth and property. And you say that to, like I said, and it just sort of, some of them get it, some of them don't, but they don't do anything.
The thing that I find so interesting in that whole conversation, Rena, is that people forget that the police are mostly reactive, right?
Yes.
They get called after something has gone wrong for the most part. How is that helpful? They're not preventing crime. They're responding to crime. how about getting to the root and eliminating the need for crime? That
great
seems
point.
so much more logical to me.
Yes, that makes so much sense. You're
That's
so right.
that's basically what I said to them in front of the council. And yeah, and they still just make these decisions because there's no way they're gonna get to the root of it. It's like let's think about what are the root causes? Why do people feel unsafe? Why is crime happening? Where is it happening? And how can we attack it that way and take care of those things and make sure that needs are met? And to me, it is such a simple concept that seems very complex to people.
And I think that what you also are up against in that conversation is this basic and kind of uniquely American again thing of, well, people should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And
I don't have any bootstraps.
Exactly. No boots, no straps. What do you want me to do here? Right.
Yeah.
And this is not the case in other Western countries where they have social safety nets that prevent people from getting into the situation that so many Americans find themselves in. And, but we blame people for their bad circumstances, but how can you honestly blame someone, a single mother who's working 2 jobs to try and support herself and her kids? How can you blame her and say that she's lazy? She's not lazy. She's working 2 jobs plus the job of taking care of her kids.
Can't even imagine.
So we value a certain kind of labor. We value a certain kind of appearance of labor. And we devalue other kinds of labor enormously.
Yep.
And we have to, this is the fight. Is to put on a level playing field people's jobs. I'm not saying if you are running a huge corporation that you don't deserve to make a good living. That's fine. But you don't deserve to be making hundreds of times what your employees are making. You just don't.
It makes no sense to society for you to be doing that.
No.
Yeah. I also want to be respectful of your time, and nothing disturbs me more than to say this. Technically, there are 7 minutes until the hour, because I would love to keep going, but I just want to make sure I put that out there.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so given that, actually, let's give you a chance to talk about some of your upcoming projects and things and where people can find you.
Sure. Well, the biggest upcoming project I have is the book that I wrote, which will be published October 24th, and I'm very excited about it. It's titled Microactivism, and the title could change, but it's Microactivism, a guide for people who want to make a difference. No bullhorn required. And that will be out in October from Story Publishing, and I'm really excited about it. Wow. It's I just believe so much in the principles of microactivism and in how it makes activism accessible for really everybody, that I can't wait for this book to be out in the world, because I feel like we have a ton of work to do and we need all hands on deck, and everyone doesn't have to do it the same way. And we need everyone's contribution in their specific way. So I'm really excited about the book. And then I'm also just, I do as many speaking engagements as I can, talking about microactivism, talking about activism for people who identify as introverts or highly sensitive, because I think that a lot of that demographic feels like, I want to do something, but I don't know how to do something without frying myself to a crisp. And so, that's actually a lot of how I started, was doing work with introverts and highly sensitive people who wanted to make a difference in their communities or the larger world, and still have 2 brain cells to rub together at the end, right?
Yeah.
Because it can be exhausting and it can be just so draining. But when you find your way, then you can keep doing it forever. And that's my goal, is to get as many people to keep doing activism their way forever as is possible, until the problems of the world are solved, which will be long after I'm gone, but I have faith. So those are the things I'm doing, and people can find me on my website, which is OMKARIWilliams.com. And there is a contact form there. So if people want to reach out to me, they can do that. And yeah, I'm not hugely on social media, but I am on Instagram, Omkari Williams. And yeah, that's where you can find me. That's what I'm up to. Mostly right now, honestly, it's pretty much book focused. It's a much bigger undertaking than I think I even understood.
Wow. Yeah. Is it going to be on ebook also?
I don't actually know. I did not ask my publisher that yet. I don't know. I hope so.
Me too.
Actually, what I would really like to do is an audio version.
Yeah, I was going to ask that next.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because you've got a podcaster's voice.
Yeah, you have a great
so
voice.
I could, yeah, I
Thank
could
you.
totally
And you'd be
see.
passionate about your own stuff too, so that'd be
I'm
great.
super passionate about my own
Yeah,
stuff.
that would be brilliant. Please do that.
So
If you
yeah,
need any
I'm
help
hopeful.
with the technical stuff, I'm sure you can figure it out. But I love to help people, and if I can help in some way,
Thank you.
Mhm.
Do not be surprised when I reach out to you.
please do. I followed you with Human Happy Hour on Instagram, and I will on my own account too. So you're welcome to contact
you.
me. I'll have advice, or you can even come up to Vermont. We'll use this microphone, whatever you want.
Perfect. Sounds like a
Blast.
plan. Yeah, once the snow stops.
Oh my God, yeah, we're about to get nailed, Rena.
Hammered.
I feel like, Jason, your ulterior motive is to get everyone to come to Vermont.
This is where people should be here in
It
Massachusetts.
is a
Really,
beautiful place. Everyone should go to Vermont, and then they
Hard.
should leave so that Vermont's not overrun.
I know.
But it's beautiful
Back
up
to
there.
privilege, though, it's not easy to come to Vermont. I won the birth lottery when I was born here, without a doubt. But it's hard to get here.
Yeah, it's not that easy to get to, but once you're there, it's worth the trip.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask you one more question? It's a question I ask
No,
every single
go for
guest.
it.
Okay, it's a hypothetical.
Oh, okay.
And it's kind of wacky. Okay, so picture yourself. What's easy, because picture yourself where you're sitting right now, and through the door, someone looks exactly like you, except they're a little more disheveled. They have like rips, and they might have a little, like they've had some kind of violence happen to them. They're just really bad day. Looks just like you, and they walk up to you and say, "Come with me. I'm from the future." What do you do?
Wow. Huh. Okay, so, well, if they're from the future and they're looking disheveled, then things have gone as badly as I fear. I would probably say, okay, give me 5 minutes. I need to pull together a few things that we're going to need for this battle that clearly you've been engaged in, and then I'm right there.
Nice. Cool.
I like that. I think you're the first person that was like, I'm going to prepare for this journey. Other people have been like, oh, I'll just go. And you're like, no, I need to get a few things. So that,
let me grab a few things, because, and actually that's sort of how I think about activism. I feel like activism is grabbing a few things and just taking them into battle intentionally rather than just sort of flailing, right? It's like, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this so that I can make the difference that I want to make in the world?
Wonderful.
So that's a great note to end on. So thank you everybody for listening, and please like, subscribe. We have a Patreon also, so we can continue to do this work. We'll put all of Omkari's information in, right, Jason? You'll put it in the.
It's already in the description. I'm pointing down
awesome.
like every, like, so cliche.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so
this.
much. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Awesome.